The roar of engines filled the broken sky as the German fighter plane trailed the limping B-17, its silver fuselage scarred and bleeding smoke. The pilot's finger hovered over the trigger, adrenaline screaming in his veins, yet he hesitated. The choice he was about to make would shatter his world forever. What unseen bond, forged in the heart of war, could change an enemy into a ghost he could never forget? It all began on a cold, gray morning above the cloud-covered battlegrounds of Europe, where sky and steel collided without mercy. Hans Müller adjusted his headset, the familiar weight of his leather-flying helmet pressing against his temples. Below, the endless expanse of clouds stretched like a white ocean, broken only by the jagged peaks of the Alps peeking through like distant islands. His Messerschmitt Bf 109 G6 sliced through the thin air at 25,000 feet, its Daimler-Benz engine purring with a deadly efficiency that had become second nature to him. Behind him, the wounded Fortress bomber limped along, one engine completely silent, the other coughing black smoke with every revolution. 3 of its 4 engines were still functioning, but barely. The big plane was clearly in distress, struggling to maintain altitude, its flight path weaving erratically across the sky. Berlin Control, this is Sturmvogel leader. I have visual on the bomber. It's heavily damaged, appears to have lost at least 1 engine and possibly more. Requesting permission to engage. Hans spoke into his radio, his voice calm despite the adrenaline coursing through his bloodstream. Sturmvogel leader, you have permission to engage. That bomber is a priority target. Destroy it, the crackling voice responded. Hans nodded, though the controller couldn't see him. His gloved hand tightened on the throttle, pushing his fighter into a slightly higher position above and behind the struggling bomber. He could see it clearly now, the distinctive silhouette of an American B-17 flying Fortress, its machine gun turret still manned despite the damage. The tail gunner was undoubtedly tracking him, waiting for the right moment to open fire. Yet something held him back. Something about the way the bomber was flying, the determination in its course, the sheer vulnerability of it all. This wasn't just a target. It was a machine full of men, just like him, fighting for their lives thousands of feet above the earth. Sturmvogel leader, what are you waiting for? The bomber is attempting to reach Switzerland. Engage now. The controller's voice grew more urgent. Hans ignored him, his eyes scanning the bomber's damaged side. He could see the gaping hole where an engine used to be, the twisted metal, the wires hanging loose. He could imagine the men inside, the pilot fighting to control the crippled aircraft, the crew tending to wounded comrades, the navigator trying to find a safe landing zone. The choice weighed heavily on him. Shoot down the bomber and complete his mission, or let it go and risk being shot down himself for disobeying orders. His finger trembled slightly above the firing button. The crosshairs of his gun sight seemed to merge with the bomber's fuselage, making it impossible to miss. One burst from his 20mm cannon, and the bomber would disintegrate, its crew plunging to their deaths. Yet he couldn't do it. Something about the bomber's plight resonated with him. He had been shot down once before over France, bailing out just moments before his own plane crashed. He knew what it felt like to be helpless, to be at the mercy of fate. To see this massive, powerful machine reduced to such a vulnerable state stirred something deep within him. Berlin Control, Sturmvogel leader. The bomber appears to be attempting to reach Swiss airspace. It's critically damaged. I recommend we let it go, Hans said, making his decision. Negative. You have your orders, Pilot Officer Müller. Engage the target immediately. This is your final warning. Hans took a deep breath. The radio chatter from the bomber's position was growing louder. He could hear the crew's voices, their urgency, their fear. They were Americans, the enemy, but they were also human beings fighting for survival. Understood, Control. Engaging now, Hans lied, his voice steady. He pushed his stick forward, lining up for what appeared to be an attack run. As he approached, he saw the bomber's dorsal turret swivel to track him, the twin .50 caliber machine guns gleaming in the weak sunlight. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. The bomber crew braced for the inevitable attack. Hans could see their faces through the cockpit windows, the tension in their expressions, the way they gripped their controls and weapons. Then, at the last possible moment, Hans pulled back on the stick, climbing away from the bomber instead of firing. He circled around, positioning himself once more behind the struggling aircraft, but this time with a different purpose. The bomber's crew watched in confusion as the German fighter pulled away, then returned. They expected the attack to come, yet it didn't. Instead, the fighter seemed to be escorting them. Hans checked his fuel gauge. He had enough to stay with them for a while to ensure they reached safety. He made a decision that would change his life forever. He would guide them to Switzerland. As the bomber limped onward, Hans flew formation off its left wing, a silent guardian against any other fighters that might appear. The distance between them was close enough that he could see the faces of the American crew, their expressions of shock and disbelief. The bomber's pilot, a man with gray-streaked hair and tired eyes, looked over at Hans and gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. It was a gesture of gratitude, of understanding, of shared humanity in the midst of war. Hans returned the nod, then motioned with his hand for the bomber to follow. He pointed downward, indicating they should descend toward the safety of neutral Swiss territory. The bomber followed, its damaged engines protesting the maneuver but holding steady. As they descended below the cloud cover, the beautiful alpine landscape spread out below, snow-capped peaks, crystal-clear lakes, peaceful valleys untouched by the horrors of war. Hans led the way, his fighter slicing through the thin mountain air. Behind him, the bomber struggled to keep pace, its damaged wings groaning under the strain. As they approached the Swiss border, Hans broke formation and flew alongside the bomber one last time. He could see the American crew watching him, their faces a mixture of relief and confusion. He gave them another nod, then pointed to the Swiss border marker below. He watched as the bomber crossed the invisible line into neutral airspace, then turned his fighter eastward, heading back toward German territory. As he flew away, Hans knew his life had changed forever. He had disobeyed a direct order, had chosen mercy over duty, had saved the lives of men who were supposed to be his enemies. And in doing so, he had forged a bond that would haunt him for the rest of his days. The roar of his own engine filled the cockpit now, but it was a different sound, not the sound of a warrior, but the sound of a man who had made a choice that would define him forever. A choice that would lead to questions, to consequences, to a friendship that transcended the boundaries of war. And as the sun began to set behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the landscape, Hans Müller knew that this was only the beginning. The true story was just about to unfold. The following morning, Hans sat in the officers' mess of his Luftwaffe base, trying to focus on his coffee while ignoring the sidelong glances from his fellow pilots. The mission yesterday had been unusual, too unusual. Everyone had heard about the bomber that had somehow slipped through German defenses and reached Switzerland. Everyone had heard about the pilot who had been assigned to intercept it, but had failed to complete his mission. Hans, what happened yesterday? The Americans are making a big deal about this bomber reaching Switzerland, his wing commander, Major Richter, asked, his tone casual but probing. Hans kept his expression neutral. It was damaged, sir. Very badly. I engaged, but couldn't finish it off. It was too far gone. Richter studied him for a moment, his eyes sharp. Too far gone? Or did you let it go? Hans met his gaze. It was beyond saving, Major. I made the call to let it attempt a landing in Switzerland rather than waste ammunition on a doomed aircraft. Richter nodded slowly, but Hans could see the suspicion in his eyes. Be careful, Hans. The SS is already asking questions about this. They don't like when bombers escape, especially ones that might have important intelligence. Understood, sir, Hans said, though his stomach tightened at the mention of the SS. The conversation moved on, but Hans knew he was being watched. Every move he made was being scrutinized now. The choice he had made had consequences that were already beginning to unfold. That evening, Hans received an unexpected visitor at his quarters. It was his older brother, Klaus Müller, a high-ranking officer in the Wehrmacht with connections that reached far beyond normal military channels. Sit down, Hans, Klaus said, his voice low and serious. I need to talk to you about yesterday. Hans gestured to the chair opposite his desk. What about it? It was just a mission. Just a mission. Klaus raised an eyebrow. The SS is investigating why you allowed a bomber full of high-ranking American officers to reach Switzerland. Why you didn't follow through on your orders. Hans felt a cold dread wash over him. What high-ranking officers? General MacArthur's son, for one. Several other important military figures. Intelligence is suggesting they were on a special mission to negotiate with Swiss officials about a separate peace. Hans cursed under his breath. He had no idea who was on that bomber. He had only seen it as a damaged aircraft in distress, not as a strategic target. I made a judgment call, Klaus. The bomber was critically damaged. It wasn't going to make it to England. I let it go to Switzerland rather than waste our resources. Klaus shook his head. That's not what the SS is hearing. They're hearing you deliberately let it escape. They're hearing you might be sympathetic to the enemy. That's ridiculous, Hans said, his voice rising. I'm a German pilot fighting for the fatherland. Is that all you are, Hans? Klaus asked quietly. Or are you something more? The question hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Hans knew exactly what his brother was implying. I did what I thought was right, Hans said, his voice now barely above a whisper. Right? Klaus leaned forward. In this war, there is no right. There is only survival. You made an enemy of the SS yesterday, Hans. An enemy you cannot afford to have. What are you saying? Hans asked, though he already knew. I'm saying you need to be more careful. Much more careful. The SS doesn't take kindly to pilots who have inconvenient consciences. They have ways of dealing with pilots who don't follow orders. Hans nodded slowly, the weight of his decision settling on him like a physical burden. I understand. You'd better, Klaus said, standing up, because the SS is watching you now, and they don't miss anything. When Klaus had left, Hans sat in the silence of his quarters, the weight of his brother's words pressing down on him. He had thought he had made a simple choice, a humane choice. But in the complex world of wartime Germany, such choices had far-reaching consequences. He thought about the American bomber crew, about the pilot who had nodded at him, about the shared understanding that had passed between enemies in the sky. He wondered if they had made it safely to Switzerland, if they were safe now. But he also wondered about his own safety. The SS was watching him, and the SS didn't forgive. They didn't forget. They punished. Hans Möller had made a choice that had saved lives, but he had also made a choice that might cost him his own. The next few days were tense. Hans flew his missions as usual, but every glance, every comment, every sideways look from his fellow officers felt like an accusation. The SS had indeed launched an investigation, and rumors were flying through the base. By Thursday, Hans was summoned to the base commander's office. Colonel von Brandt sat behind his desk, his face grim. "Mueller," the colonel said, not bothering with pleasantries. "The SS has completed their investigation regarding the bomber incident." Hans stood at attention, his heart pounding. "Yes, sir." "You are hereby removed from combat duty, effective immediately. You will be reassigned to transport and ferry duties." Hans felt a wave of relief wash over him. Transport duty was boring, safe, far from the front lines. It was a punishment, but it could have been much worse. "Thank you, sir," Hans said, keeping his expression neutral. "Don't thank me yet, Muller," von Brandt said, his voice cold. "The SS is not satisfied. They believe you deliberately let that bomber escape. They believe you may be sympathetic to the enemy." Hans forced himself to remain calm. "That's absurd, sir. I'm a German officer, loyal to the fatherland." "Is that so?" Von Brandt leaned forward. "Then why did the American pilot of that bomber send a personal message to our intelligence services? He said something about a German pilot who showed mercy. He said he would remember the face." Hans felt the blood drain from his face. How could the American have known? How could he have sent a message? "Sir, "Save it, Muller," von Brandt said, waving a hand dismissively. "The SS wants to speak with you. Alone." The mention of the SS sent a chill through Hans. The SS was not like regular military police. They were brutal, efficient, and answered to no one but Hitler himself. Being summoned by the SS was never
Hans
a good
asked,
sign.
his voice tight.
"Tonight, 9 o'clock. They'll send a car." Hans nodded, then saluted and left the office. As he walked back to his quarters, his mind raced. The SS wanted to talk to him, alone. That could mean anything from a stern warning to a one-way trip to a concentration camp. He had to think. He had to prepare. But how do you prepare for the SS? That evening, as Hans sat in his quarters trying to eat a barely edible meal, a black Mercedes sedan pulled up outside his building. Two men in black uniforms got out, their faces grim, their bearing intimidating. "Pilot Officer Möller," one of them said, his voice flat and emotionless. "You are to come with us." Hans nodded, then grabbed his coat and followed them to the car. The ride was silent, the city streets dark and empty as they drove to an anonymous building on the outskirts of town. Inside, the interrogation room was stark and cold, with a single chair and a bare bulb hanging from the ceiling. A man in a black SS uniform sat behind a metal desk, his face impassive, his eyes sharp and assessing. "Sit down, Muller," the SS officer said, his voice quiet but commanding. Hans sat, trying to keep his expression neutral. "What is this about, Hauptsturmführer?" "You know what this is about, pilot officer," the SS officer said, his fingers steepled together. "The bomber incident. The American bomber that reached Switzerland." "I was following orders," Hans said, sticking to his story. "The bomber was critically damaged. I assessed it was beyond saving." "Beyond saving?" The SS officer raised an eyebrow. "Or did you let it go because you have sympathies for the enemy?" Hans met his gaze. "I'm a German pilot, fighting for the fatherland. I have no sympathies for anyone but Germany." The SS officer leaned forward, his eyes boring into Hans. "We have intercepted a message from the American pilot. He said a German pilot showed mercy. He said he would remember the face." Hans's heart sank. The message was real. They had it. "That's a lie," Hans said, forcing his voice to remain steady. "There was no mercy involved. I made a tactical decision based on the bomber's condition." "A tactical decision?" The SS officer's voice hardened. "Or a decision based on your own personal feelings. We know about your family, Muller, your brother's connections. We know your father was a businessman who had extensive dealings with Americans before the war." Hans felt a cold dread wash over him. They had done their research. They knew about his father, about the American business contacts, about everything. "My father was a loyal German," Hans said, though the words felt hollow now. "Was he?" The SS officer leaned back in his chair, studying Hans. "Or was he a man who believed in business above all else? A man who might have sympathies for the capitalist Americans?" Hans remained silent, knowing that anything he said could be used against him. "You're in a difficult position, Muller," the SS officer said, his tone almost sympathetic. "But there's a way out of this." "What way?" Hans asked, though he already suspected. "The American who sent that message is being held in a special detention facility. We want you to go there. We want you to identify him. We want you to tell us everything about your conversation with him in the sky." Hans felt a wave of nausea wash over him. They wanted him to betray the American pilot, to turn on the man he had shown mercy to. "I can't do that," Hans said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Why not?" The SS officer's eyes narrowed. "You should want to help your country." "You're a German officer." "I do," Hans said, "but I won't betray a man who was in my power. I won't become what you are." The SS officer's expression hardened. "You don't have a choice, Muller. You either cooperate or you find yourself in a very uncomfortable situation, a situation that might involve unpleasant consequences for your family." Hans felt the blood drain from his face. They were threatening his family, his brother, his parents, everyone. "Think about it, pilot officer," the SS officer said, standing up. "We'll give you until tomorrow morning to decide, but make no mistake, the clock is ticking." As Hans was led back to the car, his mind raced. He was trapped. Between his duty to Germany and his conscience, between the SS and his morals. He had made a choice that had saved lives, but now that choice was threatening to destroy everything he held dear. The next morning, Hans made his decision. He would cooperate with the SS, but only on his own terms. He would go to the detention facility, but he would not betray the American pilot. He would find another way. At 9 o'clock, the black Mercedes returned. This time, Hans was ready. He had packed a small bag containing only essentials. He didn't know if he would be coming back. The drive to the detention facility was longer this time, taking them deep into the countryside. The building was a former monastery, converted into a high-security prison with barbed wire and guard towers. Hans was led through a series of corridors, past cells where other prisoners were being held. Finally, he was brought to an interrogation room similar to the one he had been in the night before. "Wait here," the guard said, then left the room. Hans sat in the uncomfortable chair, wondering what would happen next. He had rehearsed his story, but he knew the SS was skilled at breaking people. They would find a way to make him talk. After what seemed like an eternity, the door opened and two men entered. One was the SS officer from the previous night. The other was a man in a flight suit, his face bruised, his eyes weary. It was the American pilot. The SS officer gestured to Hans. "This is the German pilot you encountered in the sky, Captain. Tell us everything." Everything that happened between you. The American pilot looked at Hans, his expression unreadable. Hans could see the recognition in his eyes, the understanding. The American knew exactly who he was. "Captain, this is your chance to cooperate," the SS officer said, his voice hard. "Tell us what happened." The American pilot turned to Hans. "You made a choice, Hans Mueller, a choice that cost you everything." Hans felt a lump form in his throat. The American knew his name.
I had to.
He knew everything,
Hans said, keeping his voice low.
"I know," the American said, "and I understand. But now we're both in trouble because of it." The SS officer slammed his fist on the table. "Enough! Captain, start talking now!" The American pilot took a deep breath. "All right. Here's what happened. I was piloting a B-17 on a special mission to Switzerland. We were carrying important documents and personnel. We were hit by German fighters over Bavaria. 2 of our engines were knocked out. We were going down." Hans listened, knowing every word was true. "I managed to keep the plane in the air, barely. Then a German fighter approached. I thought it was the end. But the pilot, he didn't shoot. He escorted us. He guided us to Switzerland. He saved our lives." The SS officer's face was dark with anger. "He's lying. You're lying to protect him." "No," the American pilot said, meeting the SS officer's gaze. "I'm telling the truth, and I can prove it. I have the documents we were carrying. They prove that this German pilot showed mercy when he didn't have to." The SS officer's eyes widened in surprise. "What documents?" "Documents detailing a proposed separate peace between Germany and the United States," the American pilot said. "Documents that could end this war much sooner than anyone thinks." Hans felt a surge of hope. The American was telling the truth. He had the proof. The SS officer was silent for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly. "Very well. Captain, you will be taken to a secure location. Mueller, you will remain here. We need to discuss this further." As the American pilot was led away, Hans was left alone with the SS officer. The tension in the room was palpable. "The captain has given us a valuable piece of information," the SS officer said, his voice thoughtful. "Information that could change the course of this war." Hans remained silent, wondering what the SS officer was getting at. "You may have made a mistake, Mueller," the SS officer said, "but you may also have stumbled upon something important, something that could benefit Germany greatly." Hans didn't know what to say. He had no idea what the American was talking about, but the SS officer seemed intrigued. "Consider your position, pilot officer," the SS officer said, leaning forward. "You've disobeyed orders, you've shown mercy to the enemy, you've threatened national security, but you've also given us information that could be valuable." Hans met the SS officer's gaze. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that this incident could be turned to your advantage, or to your disadvantage. It depends on how you handle it from here on out." Hans felt a chill run down his spine. The SS was playing a game, and he was just a pawn in it. "What do you want me to do?" Hans asked, his voice tight. "First, you will forget everything you've heard about these documents. Second, you will continue your duties as assigned. Third, you will report any further unusual activities to me immediately." Hans nodded. "Understood." "Good," the SS officer said, standing up. "And Mueller? Try not to make any more mistakes." As Hans was led out of the building, he wondered what he had just gotten himself into. The American pilot had mentioned documents that could end the war. But what did that mean? And why was the SS so interested in them? Whatever the truth was, Hans knew one thing for certain. His life had changed irrevocably. The choice he had made in the sky had led him here, to this moment of uncertainty and danger. And he had a feeling that the true story was still far from over. The following weeks were tense for Hans. He was still flying transport missions, ferrying important personnel and supplies between bases. But every mission felt like it was being watched, every move scrutinized by the SS. He tried to put the incident with the American pilot out of his mind, but it kept coming back to haunt him. The SS had made it clear that they were monitoring him closely and that any misstep could have severe consequences. One afternoon, as Hans was preparing for a routine transport flight, he received a surprise visit from his brother Klaus. "Walk with me," Klaus said, his voice low. Hans followed him outside, away from prying eyes. "What is this about, Klaus?" "About the SS," Klaus said, his expression grim. "They've been asking questions about you, about the bomber incident." Hans felt a cold dread wash over him. "What questions?" "Questions about your loyalty. They're suggesting that you might be compromised." Hans nodded slowly. "I know. They've been watching me." Klaus studied him for a moment. "You need to be careful, Hans. The SS doesn't take chances. They see enemies everywhere, especially people who think differently." Hans met his brother's gaze. "What are you saying, Klaus?" "I'm saying you need to prove your loyalty to Germany, to the fatherland, and you need to do it soon, before the SS decides you're a liability." "Prove my loyalty? By what? Killing innocent men? By following orders without question?" "That's exactly what I'm saying, Hans," Klaus said, his voice hardening. "In times like these, there is no room for doubt, no room for mercy. There is only victory, and victory requires sacrifice." Hans looked away, unable to meet his brother's gaze. The words cut deep, reminding him of the choice he had made, the lives he had saved, the price he was now paying. "I understand," Hans said, though he knew he didn't understand at all. "Good," Klaus said, clapping him on the shoulder. "Because the SS is watching, and they're waiting." As Klaus walked away, Hans stood alone in the courtyard, the weight of his brother's words pressing down on him. He had thought he was doing the right thing, showing mercy when he could have destroyed. But now he was being accused of disloyalty, of sympathizing with the enemy. He looked up at the sky, wondering if the American bomber crew was safe, if they were thinking about him too. He wondered if they knew the trouble their survival had caused him. But more than that, he wondered what he should do. Should he continue to follow his conscience, even if it meant risking everything? Or should he give in to the pressure, to the demands of the SS, to the expectations of his family? The choice was his, and whatever he decided would change his life forever. The next mission Hans was assigned to was different from the usual transport flights. It was a high-priority mission, ferrying a SS officer and his team to a secret meeting in the Alps. The details were vague, classified top secret. As Hans prepared his aircraft, he couldn't shake the feeling that this mission was somehow connected to the bomber incident, to the documents the American pilot had mentioned. The SS officer traveling with him was the same one who had interrogated him about the incident. "Ready for takeoff, pilot officer?" the SS officer asked, his tone casual but probing. "Yes, Hauptsturmführer," Hans said, keeping his expression neutral. "Good. We have important business to attend to. Business that could affect the outcome of this war." Hans nodded, though he had no idea what the SS officer was talking about. He taxied the plane onto the runway and took off, heading toward the Alps. The flight was uneventful, but tense. The SS officer and his team sat in the back, their faces grim, their eyes watching Hans constantly. He could feel their scrutiny, their suspicion. As they approached the mountains, Hans could see the secret landing site below, a hidden valley surrounded by peaks with a small airstrip carved into the mountainside. It was the perfect place for a secret meeting. He landed the plane smoothly, then taxied to the designated area. As the SS team disembarked, Hans couldn't help but notice the tension in the air, the urgency in their movements. "Stay with the plane, pilot officer," the SS officer said. "We'll call you when we're ready to return." Hans nodded, then watched as the SS team disappeared into a nearby building. He was left alone with his aircraft, the silence of the mountains pressing in around him. As he waited, he couldn't help but wonder what was going on inside that building. What secret meeting was taking place? What important business could the SS be conducting in a hidden valley in the Alps? Then, as if in answer to his questions, he saw something that made his blood run cold. A figure emerged from the building, walking toward his plane. It was the American pilot from the bomber incident. But this wasn't the same man. This man was thinner, paler, his eyes hollow with fear. He was clearly being held against his will, escorted by 2 SS guards. As they approached, the American pilot looked directly at Hans, his expression a mixture of fear and recognition. Hans could see the question in his eyes. Why was he here? What was happening? The SS guards pushed the American pilot toward the plane, then gestured for Hans to open the door. "What's going on?" Hans asked, his voice tight. "The captain has agreed to cooperate," the SS officer said, his voice cold. "He's going to help us with our mission." Hans felt a surge of anger. The American hadn't agreed to anything. He was being forced to cooperate. As the American pilot was pushed into the plane, Hans met his gaze. The American shook his head slightly, a silent plea for help. Hans knew what he had to do. He had to get the American out of here to safety. But how? With SS guards watching his every move? As the SS team boarded the plane, Hans had an idea. He motioned to the SS officer. "There's a problem with the starboard engine. I need to check it before we take off." The SS officer eyed him suspiciously. "What kind of problem?" "It's overheating. I need to check the cooling system before we can fly safely." The SS officer hesitated, then nodded. "Fine, but make it quick. We don't have all day." Hans nodded, then climbed out of the plane and walked around to the starboard side. As he pretended to check the engine, he kept an eye on the guards. They were watching him closely, but they were also focused on the American pilot in the back. Hans made his decision. He would create a diversion, then get the American pilot out of there. As he worked on the engine, he noticed a fuel leak near the wing. He knew that if he could ignite the fuel, it would create a diversion that might allow him to get the American away from the guards. He pulled out his lighter, then pretended to check something else. When the guards weren't looking, he carefully lit a small piece of cloth, then tossed it toward the fuel leak. There was a small whoosh as the cloth ignited, then a burst of flame from the leaking fuel. The guards immediately turned their attention to the fire, shouting and trying to extinguish it. Seizing the opportunity, Hans ran back to the plane, opened the door, and grabbed the American pilot's arm. "Come with me, now!" The American pilot, startled but understanding, followed Hans out of the plane. Together they ran toward a nearby hangar, just as the SS guards realized what was happening. "Stop them! Don't let them escape!" the SS officer shouted. Hans and the American pilot ducked into the hangar, then hid behind a stack of crates as guards rushed past. They had bought themselves a few moments, but they knew they had to move fast. "We need to get out of here," Hans said, scanning the hangar for an escape route. "There's a service vehicle in the back," the American pilot said. "We can use that." Hans nodded, and they made their way to the back of the hangar, where an old truck was parked. Hot wiring it took only a moment, then they were speeding away from the airstrip into the mountains. As they drove, the American pilot finally spoke. "Thank you, Hans. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't helped me." Hans kept his eyes on the winding mountain road. "I had to. You showed me mercy when you didn't have to. I owed you." The American pilot nodded. "And I understand the cost. Your brother told me about the SS investigation, about how your life is in danger now." Hans felt a surge of anger. "Klaus told you that? How much did he tell you?" "Enough to know that you're in serious trouble," the American said, "and that you need to get out of Germany before the SS catches up with us." Hans nodded, knowing the American was right. They had to get to Switzerland, to safety. But getting there would be difficult with SS patrols searching for them. As they drove deeper into the mountains, Hans wondered what they would do next. How would they escape? Where would they go? And what about the documents the American had mentioned? What secret was he carrying that was so important the SS was willing to go to such lengths to get it? Whatever the answers were, Hans knew one thing for certain. His life had changed irrevocably. The choice he had made in the sky had led him here, to this moment of escape and uncertainty, and he had a feeling that the true story was still far from over. The drive through the mountains was tense and nerve-wracking. Every turn of the winding road brought new challenges, every shadow hiding potential danger. Hans kept a constant watch for SS patrols, while the American pilot, whose name he now knew was John Mitchell, tried to make sense of their situation. "They'll be looking for us everywhere," John said, his voice tight with anxiety. "The SS doesn't let things like this go easily." Hans nodded, focusing on the road ahead. "We need to get to Switzerland. That's our best chance." John looked at him skeptically. "Switzerland? How are we going to get across the border? The SS will have checkpoints everywhere." Hans thought for a moment. "There's an old smuggling route my father used to tell me about, through the mountains near St. Moritz. It's dangerous, but it might work." John nodded. "Better than trying to cross at an official checkpoint, but we need to be careful. The SS will be watching all the border crossings." As they continued driving, the landscape grew more remote, more rugged. The paved roads gave way to dirt tracks, then to barely visible trails winding through the dense forest. Hans had to drive slowly, carefully navigating the rough terrain. By late afternoon, they had reached a small, abandoned cabin deep in the mountains. It was hidden from view, surrounded by trees, with a small stream running nearby. "This should be safe for now," Hans said, parking the truck behind the cabin. "We can rest here for a while, figure out our next move." John nodded, looking around nervously. "How long do you think we have before the SS catches up with us?" Hans shrugged. "Hard to say. They'll be organizing a search party soon. Maybe a few hours, maybe less." John sat down on a wooden bench, running a hand through his hair. "I need to tell you something, Hans. Something important about why the SS was so interested in me." Hans sat opposite him, waiting. "What is it?" John took a deep breath. "I wasn't just carrying documents when I was shot down. I was carrying something else. Something the SS is desperate to get back." "What was it?" Hans asked, though he already had a feeling. "A list," John said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "A list of high-ranking German officials who are willing to negotiate a separate peace with the Allies." Hans felt a chill run down his spine. A list. You mean German officers who want to end the war? John nodded. Exactly. The SS found out about it. They want the list back. They want to eliminate everyone on it. Hans stared at John in disbelief. Are you telling me there are German officers who want to defect, who want to end this madness? I'm telling you there are Germans who have seen enough death and destruction, John said, his voice firm. Who believe that continuing this war is a mistake, who are willing to risk everything to stop it. Hans felt a surge of hope mixed with disbelief. Was it possible? Were there really German officers who felt the same way he did? Who's on this list? Hans asked, though he was afraid of the answer. John hesitated, then said, Your brother, Klaus Müller. Hans felt the blood drain from his face. Klaus? You're saying Klaus wants to defect? That's why the SS was so desperate to get it back. That's what the list says. They can't afford to have high-ranking officers defecting, especially not someone with Klaus's connections and influence. Hans sat in stunned silence. His own brother, the man who had warned him about the SS, the man who had pressured him to prove his loyalty, was supposedly on a list of defectors. It didn't make sense. Why would Klaus risk everything like that? I don't believe it, Hans said, shaking his head. Klaus is a loyal German officer. He wouldn't do something like that. Maybe not willingly, John said. Maybe he was approached. Maybe he was threatened. Or maybe he's been playing a dangerous game all along. Hans didn't know what to think. The revelation was too much, too sudden. His own brother, involved in something like this? It was unthinkable. Regardless, John said, his voice firm, the list is real, and the SS
They'll do anything
wants it
to
back,
get it,
including hunting us down to the ends of the earth. Hans nodded slowly, the weight of the situation settling on him. They weren't just running for their lives anymore. They were running with information that could change the course of the war, information that powerful people were willing to kill for. We need to get to Switzerland, Hans said, standing up. And we need to get that list to the right people, people who can use it to end this war. John nodded. Agreed. But first, we need to figure out how to get past the SS patrols. Hans nodded. We'll go tonight, under cover of darkness. As they prepared to leave, Hans couldn't help but wonder about his brother. Was Klaus really on that list? Was he really willing to risk everything to end the war? Or was this some kind of trap, a way to lure him into compromising himself? Whatever the truth was, Hans knew one thing for certain. His life had changed. The choice he had made in the sky had led him here, to this moment of escape and uncertainty. And he had a feeling that the true story was still far from over. The journey through the mountains that night was treacherous and dangerous. The moon was hidden behind clouds, casting the landscape in shadows and making it difficult to see. Hans and John moved carefully, using their knowledge of the terrain to avoid detection. Every sound made them jump, every shadow hiding potential danger. They knew the SS would be searching for them, and they had to be constantly vigilant. By early morning, they had reached the mountain pass near St. Moritz. The view was breathtaking, snow-capped peaks rising into the sky, crystal-clear lakes reflecting the first light of dawn, valleys stretching out below like patches of green and gold. But the beauty of the landscape was lost on Hans and John, who were focused on the task at hand, crossing the border into Switzerland without being caught. The pass was narrow and treacherous, with steep drops on either side. They had to climb carefully, using ropes and their mountain skills to navigate the difficult terrain. As they reached the summit, they saw it, the border marker, standing like a silent sentinel between war and peace. Switzerland lay just on the other side, a world away from the chaos and destruction of Nazi Germany. But between them and safety lay one final obstacle, a SS patrol that was setting up a checkpoint at the pass. "They're expecting us," John said, his voice tight with tension. Hans nodded, scanning the area. "We need to find another way around." They carefully made their way down the other side of the pass, then circled back, looking for an alternative route. After hours of searching, they found a narrow goat trail that wound through the mountains, eventually leading to a small village on the Swiss side. The trail was difficult and dangerous, but it was their only chance. They moved slowly, carefully, each step bringing them closer to safety and farther from the danger that pursued them. By late afternoon, they reached the village. It was small and quiet, with neat houses and friendly-looking people going about their daily business. For the first time in days, Hans felt a sense of relief wash over them. "We made it," John said, a smile spreading across his face. Hans nodded, though he knew their journey was far from over. They still had the list, and they still needed to get it to the right people. But for now, they were safe. As they walked through the village, they were approached by a Swiss police officer. "Papers, please," he said in French. Hans handed over his forged papers, which he had prepared for just such an emergency. The officer examined them carefully, then nodded. "You're cleared to enter Switzerland," he said. "Welcome." As Hans and John walked into the village, they felt a sense of relief wash over them. They were finally safe, finally out of reach of the SS. But they knew their work was just beginning. The list was still in John's possession, and it needed to be delivered to the right people. People who could use it to end the war, to save lives, to bring peace to a world torn apart by conflict. As they settled into a small hotel, Hans couldn't help but think about his brother, about the revelation that Klaus was supposedly on the list of defectors. Was it true, or was it some kind of trap? Whatever the truth was, Hans knew one thing for certain. His life had changed irrevocably. The choice he had made in the sky had led him here, to this moment of safety and uncertainty, and he had a feeling that the true story was still far from over. The following days in Switzerland were a mixture of relief and anxiety. Hans and John were safe, but they knew they couldn't stay in one place for long. The SS would be looking for them, and they had to find a way to get the list to the right people. John made contact with American intelligence operatives in Zurich, arranging a meeting to hand over the list. The operatives were cautious, skeptical at first, but when John showed them the list, their expressions changed from doubt to excitement. "This is incredible," one of the operatives said, examining the document. "If this is authentic, it could change everything." John nodded. "It's authentic. I risked my life to bring it here." Hans watched the exchange, feeling a sense of pride mixed with anxiety. This was what he had fought for, what he had risked everything for: to end the war, to save lives, to bring peace. But as he watched the American operatives examine the list, he couldn't help but wonder about his brother. Was Klaus really on that list? Was he really willing to risk everything to end the war? The operatives took the list, promising to get it to the right people in Washington. Hans and John were given new identities, new papers, and a plan to get them out of Switzerland and to safety. As they prepared to leave, John turned to Hans. "I don't know what to say, Hans. You saved my life, and I don't know how I can ever repay you." Hans nodded. "You don't need to repay me. We both did what we had to do." John smiled. "Maybe. But I'll never forget what you did. I'll never forget your face." As they parted ways, he was
Hans
heading
felt
to
a sense
America,
of closure,
starting a new
but
life,
also of
but
uncertainty.
he would always carry the memories of his past, of the choice he had made, of the bond he had formed with an enemy in the sky. The journey to America was long and arduous, but Hans finally made it to New York. He was given a new identity, a new life, and a chance to start over. But he knew that the past would always be with him, that the choice he had made would always be a part of who he was. Years passed, and the war ended. Germany was defeated. The world began to heal, and Hans started to build a new life for himself. He married, had children, and tried to put the horrors of war behind him. But he never forgot the American pilot, never forgot the choice he had made in the sky, never forgot the bond that had formed between enemies in the midst of conflict. Then, one day, many years later, Hans received a surprising letter. It was from John Mitchell, the American pilot he had saved. John had been searching for him for years, trying to find the German pilot who had shown him mercy in the sky. The letter was simple, heartfelt, and full of gratitude. John had written a book about his experiences during the war, and he wanted Hans to know that he had never forgotten him, had never forgotten the kindness shown to him by an enemy. As Hans read the letter, tears welled up in his eyes. He had made a choice that had changed his life forever, a choice that had led to pain and suffering, but also to friendship and understanding. He picked up his pen and began to write back, telling John his story, explaining why he had made the choice he had made and how it had affected his life. The correspondence between them continued for years, a bridge between two men who had once been enemies, now bound by a friendship forged in the heart of war. And as Hans looked back on his life, he knew that the choice he had made in the sky had been worth it. It had cost him everything, his career, his country, his family. But it had also given him something more valuable than anything he had ever lost. It had given him peace. The years passed, and the world continued to change. The scars of war slowly healed, though they never completely disappeared. Hans Muller settled into his new life in America, becoming a successful businessman, raising a family, and trying to put the horrors of the past behind him. But he never forgot the faces of the men in the B-17, never forgot the choice he had made, never forgot the bond that had formed between enemies in the sky. John Mitchell became a celebrated author and speaker, traveling the world telling his story of survival and kindness. He often spoke about the German pilot who had shown him mercy and how that single act of humanity had changed his life forever. Their correspondence continued, a bridge between two men who had once been enemies, now bound by a friendship forged in the heart of war. They wrote letters, exchanged photos, and occasionally met in person, their friendship growing stronger with each passing year. Then one day, Hans received a phone call that would change everything again. It was John, and his voice was filled with urgency and fear. "Hans, I need your help," John said. "Something terrible has happened." Hans felt a chill run down his spine. "What is it, John?" "It's about the list," John said. "The list of German defectors. It's been stolen." Hans felt a cold dread wash over him. "Stolen? By whom?" "I don't know," John said, his voice tight with anxiety. "But I have a bad feeling about it. I think it might be connected to the SS. Hans thought for a moment, then said, "What do you want me to do?" "I need you to come to Germany," John said. "I need your help. I think someone is trying to track down the men on that list, eliminate them." Hans hesitated, then nodded. "I'll come. When?" "As soon as possible. This is urgent." As Hans prepared for his trip back to Germany, he couldn't help but feel a sense of apprehension. He had left Germany behind, had started a new life, and now he was being drawn back into the shadows of his past. But he knew he had to go. John needed his help, and he owed him that much. The choice he had made in the sky had bound them together, and he couldn't turn his back on that bond now. The flight to Germany was long and arduous, filled with memories and emotions. As Hans stepped off the plane in Frankfurt, he felt a surge of nostalgia mixed with anxiety. The Germany he had known was gone, replaced by a new nation still coming to terms with its past. John met him at the airport, looking tired but determined. "I'm glad you could come, Hans." Hans nodded. "What's going on, John? Tell me everything." As they drove to John's hotel, John explained the situation. The list had been stolen from a secure facility in Washington, and there were indications that it was being used to track down the men on it, eliminate them. "I don't know who's behind it," John said, "but I have a feeling it's connected to old SS networks, people who are still operating in the shadows." Hans felt a chill run down his spine. "Klaus was on that list. Do you think he's in danger?" John nodded. "That's what I'm afraid of. If someone is trying to eliminate the men on the list, Klaus could be a target." Hans felt a surge of anger mixed with concern. His own brother, the man who had warned him about the SS, was now in danger because of that list. "We have to find out who's behind this," Hans said, his voice firm. "We have to stop them before it's too late." As they arrived at the hotel, Hans couldn't help but wonder what awaited them. The past was coming back to haunt them, and they would have to face it together. The investigation into the stolen list was dangerous and complex. Hans and John worked together, using their skills and connections to uncover the truth. They interviewed former SS officers, tracked down leads, and followed trails that led them deeper into the shadows of Germany's past. As they dug deeper, they began to uncover a disturbing pattern. Men on the list were being targeted, eliminated one by one. Each death was made to look like an accident, a suicide, a natural death. But Hans and John knew better. They knew these were murders, carried out by someone who wanted to erase the past, to silence the truth. The trail eventually led them to a former SS officer named Heinrich Vogel, a man who had risen to power in the post-war years, building a network of influence and control. Vogel had been involved in the original investigation of the bomber incident, and he had always suspected that Hans had been sympathetic to the enemy. "Hans Müller," Vogel said when they finally confronted him. "I've been expecting you." Hans met his gaze, his expression calm despite the tension in the room. "We know what you're doing, Vogel. We know you're eliminating the men on the list." Vogel smiled, a cold, calculated expression. "The list is a threat to Germany, to the new Germany we've built. Those men are traitors, and they need to be dealt with." John stepped forward. "They're not traitors. They're men who wanted to end the war, to save lives." Vogel's expression hardened. "Cowards who didn't have the stomach to see the war through to victory." Hans felt a surge of anger. "Victory? At what cost? Millions of dead? Cities in ruins? Is that the victory you wanted?" Vogel's eyes narrowed. "You don't understand, Hans. You never did. You were always too soft, too weak to see the bigger picture." Hans met his gaze, his voice firm. "I saw plenty, Vogel. I saw the horror, the destruction, the waste, and I saw that there had to be a better way." Vogel laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. "A better way? There is no better way. There is only victory or defeat." John stepped between them. "This isn't about victory or defeat anymore. It's about truth, about justice, about making sure that what happened during the war never happens again. Vogel's expression darkened. You don't know what you're talking about. You have no idea what it takes to maintain order, to keep the peace. We know enough, Hans said. We know that you're using the list to eliminate anyone who knows the truth, anyone who might expose your network. Vogel nodded slowly. You're a smart man, Hans. Too smart for your own good. He gestured to his guards. Take them away. As Hans and John were led away, Hans knew that their fight was far from over. Vogel was a powerful man, with connections throughout Germany and beyond. Eliminating him wouldn't be easy, but they had to try. For the men on the list, for the truth, for the future. The confrontation with Vogel had escalated the situation dramatically. Hans and John were now in serious danger, targets of a powerful network that was determined to protect its secrets at any cost. They went into hiding, using safe houses provided by John's contacts in American intelligence. Every move they made was carefully planned, every step calculated to avoid detection. But Vogel's men were everywhere, watching, waiting, ready to strike at any moment. One evening, as Hans and John were discussing their next move, they received an unexpected visitor. It was Klaus Müller, Hans's brother, looking tired but determined. I had to come, Klaus said, his voice low. I heard you were back in Germany. I heard you were in trouble. Hans felt a surge of mixed emotions, relief, anger, concern. Klaus, you shouldn't be here. I know. It's not safe, Klaus said, sitting down. But I had to see you. I had to tell you something important. Hans waited, his heart pounding. What is it? Klaus took a deep breath. The list. It's not what you think. Hans frowned. What do you mean? The list was created by the SS, Klaus said, his voice dropping to a whisper. It was a trap, a way to identify and eliminate anyone who was sympathetic to ending the war. Hans stared at his brother in disbelief. A trap? You're saying the list was fake? Klaus nodded. Completely fake. Vogel created it. He's been using it for years to eliminate anyone who might stand in his way, anyone who knows too much about the SS network. Hans felt a cold dread wash over him. But what about the men who were killed? The ones on the list? Klaus shook his head. They weren't on any real list. Vogel just picked targets, people he wanted eliminated, and added their names to make it look like there was a conspiracy. Stepped forward. But why? What's his endgame? Klaus looked at them both, his expression grim. Vogel is building a new SS network. A network that will operate in the shadows, controlling Germany from behind the scenes. He's using the list to eliminate anyone who might oppose him, anyone who might expose his plans. Hans felt a surge of anger mixed with understanding. So the whole thing was a lie. From the beginning. The bomber incident. Vogel has been playing a long game. Everything. He wanted to create chaos, to destabilize Germany, so he could step in and take control. John's expression hardened. We have to stop him, before it's too late. Klaus nodded. That's why I'm here. I want to help. I want to bring Vogel down. Hans looked at his brother, seeing the determination in his eyes, the commitment to justice. For the first time in years, he felt a sense of hope. All right, Hans said, his voice firm. We'll stop him. As they planned their next move, Hans felt a sense of closure, of coming full circle. The choice he had made in the sky had led him here, to this moment of truth and justice. And he knew that whatever happened next, he was doing the right thing. The plan to take down Vogel was dangerous and complex, requiring precision and timing. Hans, John, and Klaus worked together, using their skills and connections to gather evidence, to build a case against him. They documented Vogel's crimes, collected testimonies from his victims, and built a file that would expose his network to the world. The final confrontation came one evening in Vogel's heavily fortified compound. Hans, John, and Klaus approached under cover of darkness, moving silently, carefully. As they infiltrated the compound, they encountered Vogel's guards, but they were prepared. Using their training and skills, they neutralized the threats, moving deeper into the building. Finally, they reached Vogel's office, where he was waiting for them, a smirk on his face. "I was expecting you," Vogel said, standing up. "You should have stayed in America, Hans, where it was safe." Hans met his gaze, his expression calm. "We came for justice, Vogel, for the truth." Vogel laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. "There is no truth, only power." John stepped forward. "There is truth, Vogel, and there is justice, and you're about to face both of them." Klaus stood beside them, his expression grim. "Your network is finished, Vogel. Your crimes are exposed." Vogel's expression darkened. "You don't know what you're doing. You're destroying Germany." "We're saving Germany," Hans said, his voice firm. "From people like you." As the tension in the room mounted, Hans knew that this was the moment of truth, the moment of justice. The moment that would finally bring an end to the long shadow of the SS, to the darkness that had haunted them all these years. Vogel reached for a hidden alarm, but Klaus was faster. He disarmed it, then turned to Vogel with a cold expression. "It's over, Heinrich. Your reign of terror is finished." Vogel's face contorted with rage and frustration. "You'll pay for this, all of you." Hans met his gaze, then nodded to John. "It's time." As John began to document the evidence, Klaus made the call to authorities to bring Vogel to justice. And Hans stood there, watching, knowing that this was the end of a long journey, the culmination of the choice he had made in the sky so many years ago. The choice that had changed his life forever, that had led him here, to this moment of truth and justice. As the authorities arrived, as Vogel was led away in handcuffs, Hans felt a sense of peace wash over him. The past was finally behind him, the shadows gone, the truth revealed. And as he looked at John and Klaus, he knew that the bond they had forged in the heart of war had been worth everything. It had led them here, to this moment of redemption, of closure, of peace. The years that followed were a time of healing and rebuilding. Vogel's network was dismantled, his crimes exposed, justice served. Germany began to heal, to move forward, to build a new future based on truth
Miller returned
and
to America.
reconciliation. But he was a different man now. The choice he had made in the sky had changed him, had given him purpose, had given him peace. He continued his work, his business, his family life, but he also became an advocate for peace, for understanding, for the importance of mercy even in times of war. John Mitchell continued his writing and speaking, sharing his story of survival and kindness, of the bond that had formed between enemies in the sky. His books became bestsellers, his message of hope and understanding resonating with people around the world. Klaus Müller stayed in Germany, working to rebuild his country, to ensure that the horrors of the past would never be repeated. He became a respected figure, a voice of reason and reconciliation in a nation still coming to terms with its history. And through it all, the three men remained friends, their bond growing stronger with each passing year. They corresponded regularly, visited each other when possible, and shared their stories with the world, showing that even in the darkest of times, humanity could prevail. Hans often looked back on his life, on the choice he had made in the sky, and he knew that it had been worth it. It had cost him everything, his career, his country, his family, but it had also given him something more valuable than anything he had ever lost. It had given him peace. And as he grew older, as his children grew up, as the world continued to change. Hans Müller knew that the choice he had made that day in the sky would always be with him, a reminder of the power of mercy, the importance of choosing kindness, even when it costs everything. For in the end, that was the true lesson of war, that even when we are divided by conflict, by ideology, by nationality, we are still human. And in our humanity, there is always the capacity for compassion, for understanding, for peace. And that, Hans knew, was the greatest victory of all. Epilogue. The legacy of mercy. The story of Hans Müller and John Mitchell became a legendary tale of courage and compassion, a story that transcended borders and generations. It was told in books, in films, in classrooms around the world, a reminder of the power of mercy even in the darkest of times. Hans lived to be an old man, his mind still sharp, his spirit still strong. He would often sit on his porch, looking out at the ocean, thinking about the choice he had made so many years ago, about the bond that had formed between enemies in the sky. He would think about John, about Klaus, about the impact their story had had on the world, about how a single act of kindness, a single choice made in the heat of battle, could change so many lives, could shape the course of history. And he would smile, knowing that he had made the right choice. That in choosing mercy over destruction, in choosing compassion over hatred, he had found something more valuable than any victory, any medal, any recognition. He had found peace. John Mitchell continued his work as an author and speaker, his voice growing stronger with each passing year. He traveled the world, sharing his story, inspiring others to choose kindness, to understand that even in times of war, there is always room for mercy. Klaus Müller remained in Germany, working to ensure that his country would never again descend into darkness. He became a respected elder statesman, a voice of wisdom and reconciliation, his life's work dedicated to building a better future. And through it all, their friendship remained, a testament to the fact that even when we are divided by conflict, by ideology, by nationality, we can still find common ground, still build bridges of understanding, still create bonds that transcend the boundaries of war. The story of Hans Müller and John Mitchell became more than just a tale of two pilots. It became a symbol of hope, a reminder that even in the darkest of times, there is always the possibility of light, and as the years passed, of peace. As the world continued to change, their story continued to inspire, to teach, to remind us all of the power of choosing mercy, even when it costs everything. For in the end, that was the true lesson of war, that even when we are divided by conflict, by ideology, by nationality, we are still human. And in our humanity, there is always the capacity for compassion, for understanding, for peace. And that, Hans Müller knew, was the greatest victory of all.